What's going on, guys? Welcome back to your Lake Fork Guide. Today we're going to talk about moon phases. Specifically, we're going to talk about the secrets, the untold truths about moon phases that you need to know that will help you catch 50% more bass. It's springtime. Moon phases are a big deal. We all know, I think everybody has at least some idea that the moon cycles affect bass during the springtime, especially. They affect all wildlife at all times. I think some people believe that. I believe that. I think most people that are outdoorsmen believe that. But especially during the springtime and the spawning cycle, that's when in bass fishing the moon gets talked about and thought about the most, it seems like. And it does have a major effect on them. There is definitely some things you need to know about the moon and how it affects their movements during the springtime to catch more bass. There's times when they'll be in the backs of pockets and spawning areas. There's times when they'll be feeding in staging areas that are not in the same spot. Like, you got to do different things. You got to fish different techniques and different tactics, but also different locations as well. And so today we're going to uncover some of those untold truths. And the reason I say it'll help you catch 50% more bass is because the way I figure it, you got a 50-50 chance. You can be wrong about where they are or right about where they are. Today we're going to try and give you all the information that I've gathered over the years through research I've done. I gathered this information by watching the professional tournaments when they were here during the spring, what the moon cycles did to those fish. Because when they're here, you get to see them for 7 days. So you get to see them for half of a moon cycle and how it affects them. There's usually a full or a new moon either before, during, or right after those professional tournaments. So you can really learn a lot, because at that time, you've got 80, 90, 100 of the best anglers on the earth, and you can watch, kind of see what all of them are doing. I've been fortunate enough to get a chance to talk to them about what they're seeing on the water throughout their 7-day period here. And really in April of 2021, 2 years ago, the Bassmasters was here, and that was the event that really uncovered a lot of the untold truths for me. Getting a bigger data sample of seeing really good anglers fish, and there was a moon, a full moon popped up on the last day of that event, or maybe the day after. It was, the full moon was right at the end of the event, and knowing that the new moon was 2 weeks before that really showed me a lot about what went on during that tournament. And I broke it down about a month after that tournament and shared it with you guys here on this channel. So these moon cycles are going to affect when these fish are really locking into beds and when more of them are pulling into beds. And it's going to tell you when more of them are feeding up on shallow points, is another pattern on fork we talk about a lot this time of year. And if you can ever get the ebb and flow right, where you know when to fish the shallow points and when to fish the pockets, man, you can be really, really dangerous on Lake Fork and on all these lakes. Really, these fish are all affected the same way by these lunar cycles. Myself, what brought this idea up to make this video is, man, I have a tendency to push the bed fishing deal. Like, even when there's not that many up, like, I want to go make it work on the bed fishing deal. I enjoy doing it so much. I have customers that enjoy doing it, that book specifically for it. And so even when there's not as many fish up as there should be, we really try to force the bed fishing deal. And I've gotten into that here lately at Fork, and we've still been catching some good fish most days, every day, until 2 days ago now for me, was really bad on the bed fishing. We only caught a couple off beds. That night, it prompted me to go back and rewatch this video that I made 2 years ago, and I retaught myself some good secrets. And lo and behold, the very next day, which is earlier today, found fish more in the staging mode than the spawning mode, and it really opened my eyeballs. You know what? I was right. Like, that video 2 years ago is correct. It's true. It's very good quality information. So we're going to replay that segment that I did. It's not too terribly long. It is a long talk, but it's not just awful long. Hopefully you guys will gain something out of this. I really do think if you soak this information in, that you will catch 50% more bass. Like, it will get you in the right areas, right? Like, on the days when you're supposed to be staging, you'll be staging. On the days when you're supposed to be looking for spawners, you'll be looking for spawners. Keep in mind, when those fish are spawning, they're really stationary. They're not moving. You got to slow down. Even if you're not looking at them, you got to slow down, get in the backs of the pockets where they will spawn, and fish really slow techniques to catch them when they're spawning. If they're staging, you can wind them up and catch them on moving baits and reaction baits and things like that, because they're feeding and they're more willing to chase baits down. So that's something to keep in mind as you watch this. Man, take a look. Let me know what y'all thought. Drop it in the comments. Thank you guys as always. What I have here is a 2-week calendar. I got Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. The reason I did that is because our full moon to new moon cycle basically goes every 2 weeks. I think it's 15 days, but it's basically every 2 weeks. So if I have a full moon right here, we'll just put an F. If I have a full moon right here on Sunday, well, I'm going to have a new moon over there on the 2 weeks from then Saturday, right? So that's kind of how that works. So in between, and the reason I drill these days that I'm going to show you. Here's how this works in my opinion with fish. They arrive to spawn right here on the day of the moon or right here, whether it's full or new. The only difference between full and new that I really see is that if all weather conditions are the same, water temps are basically the same, you'll get a higher number of fish that move in on a full moon than you will on a new moon. But there's definitely still a significant wave that pulls in on a new moon. What I see, or my opinion, is they get here on a full moon and the males immediately go to getting on beds on that day and really on the day after. So you'll have males starting to lock in the 2 days after the full moon and even the day of the full moon. But that third day, fourth day, fifth day, that's when you seem to get, for me, the most amount of females. About 3 days after, 4 or 5 days after, even 6 days after at times. It's when you get the most amount of females locking in. Now, some females are going to come in here the day after and lock in. Some females are going to lock in 2 days after. But the majority of them will lock in 3 to 5 days after the moon cycle. Now, once they've locked in, some of them are only going to be there for a day. Some of them are not even there for a full day. Some of these females will stay for several days. The males will certainly stay sometimes for 2 to 3 weeks. At times, a male will stay on a bed, depending on how much light penetration, how long the eggs take to hatch, all that good stuff. But the general rule of thumb is, once you get to the halfway point, you're losing fish on beds. It's like new fish on beds, a few fish on beds, and then as we get away from that, once we reach kind of that 5th and 6th day after, now we're going to start less. Your bed fish are going to go from up here, and you're going to go less and less and less and less until you basically hit the bottom right before the new moon or the next moon cycle. This could be a new and this could be a full. You can switch those two. So you can kind of see what happens is they show up on the full moon. We'll just do this right here. This will be good. They show up on the full moon, and it kind of goes like this. It starts about right here on the full moon, and it just goes up gradually, 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 levels off. And that's kind of the arc of how I see bedfish coming in. Now, I think there's a little bit of misconception in bass fishing in general over the years. Everybody thinks the first day or two after the moon cycle, that's when you're going to have the most fish on beds. In my experience, that's not true. I think people have always assumed, and I've been kind of under this understanding over the years myself, that fish pull into the pockets leading up to the full moon, and then when the full moon hits, bam, they're on beds. That's not really how I've seen it go down. In other lakes, maybe they lock in faster. Lake Fork does have an extreme amount of pressure. There's a lot of outside human influence on these fish on Lake Fork that could cause that to be why they cycle this way. So that's kind of your general consensus. Full moon, 3 days after, man, you're going to kind of hit the peak. 5, 6 days after, you're going to start to dwindle down after that, and then it's going to fall off pretty quick. Now, the reason I drew this graph is because if bass aren't on beds this time of year, there's two things that go on from about March through May every year. And this year, it's going to be all the way through the end of May and even on into June. There's two different things that really go on in a big way, and that's going to be shallow staging fish that are feeding in pre and post spawn situations, and spawning fish that are in the backs of pockets doing their spawning thing. The higher this arc is, the less fish that will be out there staging. At the bottoms of this arc, Okay? That's where the most fish are going to be staging and feeding on the shallow staging areas. Shell bed points, shallow points, clay points, hard points. Just the shallow feeding grounds out on the main lake or out at the mouth of the creek, stuff like that. You're going to have more fish out doing that at the lower times of this graph, and you'll have more fish spawning at the higher times. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. If we look at the most recent Bassmaster Elite Series tournament, here we go. The days of the week don't correlate, but this is how that worked out. Practice, 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 day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. I'm sorry, I drew that wrong. 1 second. Let me fix that real quick. I was 1 day off on that. Okay, this is how it worked out. The only difference was this was a full. And this was a new. So for the Elite Series, you had practice, practice, practice. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. The day after was a full moon. Now, if you look at this graph, that maps out exactly to what we saw with the Elite Series event. If you watch the practice reports, everybody was talking, me included, talking about sight fishing. Well, no wonder we were talking about sight fishing. Look what had been going on. Look at what cycle we were in. I mean, yeah, we were looking at sight fishing. Then on day 1, there was quite a bit of sight fishing going on. Now, there were some staging guys that got by. Day 2, there were some staging guys that got by, but we had funny weather that kind of messed about it for everybody on day 2. Day 3, the staging guys really took over. The guys fishing staging fish really kind of took over the event on day 3. And by day 4, we all saw what happened. Lee Livesey catches 42 pounds. That's one of the all-time record days on staging fish. Patrick Walters catches 30-something pounds on staging fish. Zaldane was 1 landed fish short of a 30-pound bag on staging fish. That bite really, as that term went on, the staging fish bite really took over. But that's where we were in this cycle. So after analyzing what happened in the Elite Series event, and I was fortunate enough to get to pay a lot of attention to what happened, watch a lot of live coverage, spent some time on the water, watching, talk, as you guys saw in the video, got to talk to a lot of guys behind the scenes at the weigh-in. After watching that Elite Series event and really observing what happened, and combining that with my knowledge of kind of how, I for a long time thought that I knew that the sight fishing peaked several days after the moon, not right after it like most people thought. But combining what I've seen with what I saw those guys do, that's how I come up with this little thesis right here. This moon changes everything in the springtime, and it's a 2-week cycle. And you will be much more consistent and have much more chance at a successful day if you're reading the moon phases and paying attention to this cycle and going by this cycle right here, in my opinion. So, that's an explanation of how the fish relate to the moon as far as spawning cycles go. And there's, like we've said, there's a 2-way go on Lake Fork. You can fish for staging fish, and you can fish for spawning fish. And the reason that I've dove in so much and I spent so much time dwelling on this and thinking about it is because cheers, y'all. Is because for years you had guys that were one or the other. And I fell more into the sight fishing category. I would just sight fish every day. And there's always some up. Once you get kind of into the good sight fishing season, there's always some that you can go sight fish. And Lake Fork has big enough male bass that you can go back there and pick some males off and scrape together a good day, most days sight fishing. Then there's guys that, you know, like the late great Mark Pack, he wasn't going sight fishing. Like, you know, he's going staging fish, man. That's what he wants to do. That's what he's gonna do. You know, Lee Livesey, that just won the Elite Series, he wanted no part of sight fishing in that tournament. He wanted to do the staging fish deal, and he stayed with it. And for years, what I've seen on Lake Fork is you have guides and locals that fish all the time that do one or the other. They just go with what they feel more confident in, what they're more comfortable doing, what they want to do. And guys will hit those staging fish, and boy, when we're in these low parts on this graph, when we're here and we're here, those guys fishing staging fish, whack them. But right in here, those guys will have some off days and struggle. And this is always the response you get. Man, we swinging for the fences. We're out here where those big ones come to feed. Sometimes you're going to miss them. Yeah, if they're all moving in, if a bunch of them move into spawn and there's less fish out there, you're right, you are going to miss them. Your chances of missing them are going to increase. Then the sight fishing guys would whack them here, and then we have to grind out males and not catch as good a fish in the down times. What I want to do, what I want to become, is a guy that can go back and forth in between and know when to go back and forth in between. And that's what I'm trying to figure out. And this is something that I'm still, by no means am I like really good at this, because that sight fishing calls my name too much, honestly. But I haven't got it dialed in just yet. But this, to me, the guys that can figure this out and can do both, can sight fish, can catch spawning bass, and catch staging bass effectively, that's going to be the guy that's the most consistent, outstanding fisherman on Lake Fork throughout the springtime, year after year. He's going to be able to lock it down, because no matter what the fish are doing, he's going to have knowledge of what they're doing and why they're doing it, and he's going to be so consistent that he's just going to be better than everybody else. And that's what I want to try to become. So that's why I'm working on this little thesis, and I'm trying to put it together and understand it. And like we always do here, I want you guys to learn with me. So we're putting it out there. But if you can be that guy that's good at catching spawning fish for, 3, 5, 6 days in here, and then also be that guy that's good at catching staging fish for 6 or 7 days on either side of it, you can have one hell of a time in the spring. Because these fish aren't hard, like they're about as easy to catch as they ever get. They're up there defending a bed. They're dumb. They let you look at them and they still bite. They get out staging. They're either pre-spawn about to go on to bed, or they're post-spawn starving to death. They're feeding. When you're catching them on those stage areas, they're there just to feed. That's the only reason they're there. So when you run across them, you catch them pretty easy. Like, if you can have that dialed in consistently, holy cow, the damage you can do throughout a spring cycle, whew, it can be crazy. So there it is. That's the 2-week moon cycle. It's actually a 15-day, but 2-week moon cycle theory that I have come up with right here. Now, we just had a new moon 2 days ago. So right now, for the next few days, you should target spawning fish. This is the peak time. Tomorrow starts the peak time for the next few days to target spawning bass. As we get on towards the later part, like Sunday, maybe Saturday, but Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, that's when you're going to want to go back to the staging fish. You're going to be in between cycles at that point. That's how you do that. You just got to pay attention to those moon cycles and when they're coming. So, pretty interesting stuff. Y'all let me know what y'all thought. I found it extremely interesting. The more that I dove into it and thought about it, what do you guys think? Cody May says he went to Hallbrook today for fun, and a lot of fish still have eggs. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of fish still have eggs in all the lakes around here pretty much. There is one more aspect to the moon cycle that you got to pay attention to, and it's more important for the staging deal than it is for the spawning deal. Eric, I'll get onto that in just a minute. Got a good question here. A-Red Fishing says, so when you're saying targeting staging fish, you mean like move off of a spawning flat into the channel? Not necessarily into the channel. Like, a lot of our staging fish are caught on really shallow points that are kind of outside the spawning areas. But yeah, get out of the backs of pockets and go look for staging points, shallow feeding tables, shell beds, stuff like that. So the other aspect that the moon brings in is the daily aspect of peak times of activity and lull times of activity. Now, you can look up lunar tables and they'll give you this. They'll give you the peak times of activity. Okay? For spawning fish, it doesn't seem to be as adamant about when they're the most locked on or anything like that. The sun has a lot to do with when the spawning fish are the easiest to catch and when they lock on, in my personal opinion. But for the staging fish especially, there is going to be a correlation to this peak activity. Of course, you're going to have your early morning first light feeding hour. That's going to happen. You're going to have your low light at the end of the day feeding time. But throughout the middle of the day, okay, there's going to be times when those fish pick up activity levels and really feed. Show you how that works. So this bottom graph, and again, I know it's backwards, but I'll explain it to you. So this is the world, and you're sitting on top of the world. That's where you're located. When the moon is overhead or underfoot, that's a P for prime. That's the prime feeding time when the moon is directly overhead or directly underfoot. When the moon is directly to your side, be it east or west, that's your secondary best time. There's not as much activity as during the prime, but it's the second best time of the day is to the sides. These quartering times, when the moon is at a quarter away from you, whether it's between overhead and east or underfoot and east or whatever it's between, I'll put some interesting things here for you guys. Let's see. This one says it sucks. This one says go eat lunch. That one says nap time, and that one says 5 o'clock somewhere. Because if you're fishing for staging fish and you're not in one of the low light hours to kind of pick up the activity level, and you're in one of these quartering, where the moon's quartering away from you, you might as well just forget it. Like, there's just not a lot of activity, in my experience, during those quartering hours. Now, that doesn't mean you can't grind out a bite or 2 or 3 somewhere in those windows. And on Lake Fork, that's worth it because you never know how big the bite's going to be. But my point is, those quartering moons, when the moon's a quarter away from you as far as the overhead position, those are the lowest activity times. Overhead and underfoot is great. Now, with a full moon, it will be overhead at noon, and it will be underfoot. And I'm sorry, it'll be underfoot at noon, and it will be overhead at midnight on the day of the full moon. Now, if you look at that, that's important to know, because one of our peak staging periods is leading up to the full moon, the last few days leading up to the full moon. Well, on the last day before the full moon, okay, that peak activity hour is going to be close to the middle of the day when you're fishing. It's going to be from 10:30 to 12:30. That window in that 11 o'clock hour is going to be your peak activity hour while you're fishing that day. That's important to know. Your secondary activity level is going to be right at daylight, and your other secondary activity is going to be right at dusk or pretty close to it, around 5 o'clock in the evening. So you might not be fishing for that one or the morning one. You might only have the overhead, the underfoot full moon, maybe your only good feeding window outside of the low light conditions that are there every day when you're leading up to the full moon. So it's important to know what time that moon is overhead and underfoot. If I was fishing Lake Fork tomorrow, what would I target? Secondary points? No, actually, right now we had a new moon on Monday. So today's Wednesday, so tomorrow's 3 days removed from a new moon. So if you look at that and look at our little graph here, 1, 2, 3. Man, look, we're hitting the peak of the spawning. So I would actually be in the, we're 3 days after. 1, 2, 3. This is tomorrow. We're just hitting the peak of the spawning cycle for this new moon. So no, I would be focused on spawning fish tomorrow. And for the next few days, I would be strictly focused on spawning fish. Targeting spawning fish in the backs of pockets. I know tomorrow's Thursday, but the new moon was on Monday, not Sunday. Don't pay attention to the letters. I'm just paying attention to when the new moon was. 1, 2, 3. The new moon was on Monday. So Tuesday, Wednesday, tomorrow's Thursday. This is where we are tomorrow as far as the moon cycle goes. So yeah, so for Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and maybe even Monday, I'm going to be looking at spawning fish. Then as we get into Tuesday, I'm going to start mixing it up. By the time we get to next Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, man, I'm going to be strictly looking, I'm going to start to really look towards the end of next week at only fishing for staging fish. Hope that helps. Do the times change with the moon cycles on when it will be underfoot and overhead? If so, could you give examples? Yeah. So on a full moon, like I said, on a full moon, it'll be directly overhead at midnight, directly underfoot at noon. As you get the next day, it'll be overhead and underfoot just a little bit later. Just a little bit later. Just a little bit later each day. So Friday of this week will still be in that really good spawning cycle. There'll be some fish starting to go out to the staging deal, but in my opinion, there'll be more spawning. The other thing is now we've gone through a couple of cycles of spawning bass already, so there's post-spawn fish already out there. So the later you get into the year, there's already more post-spawn fish that are out there. So the staging bite becomes more prevalent later in the year, even when there's fish spawning, because there's already enough that have already come and done their thing. Now, when the Bassmaster tournament was here, like if this tournament would have been like the 4 days before it was, man, it would have been like sight fishing galore, and those guys fishing staging fish would have had a harder time because we just hadn't had a lot of spawners yet at that time. So everything, as those fish were moving into spawn, that was pretty much what all of them were doing that were already pulled up. Now there were still some out that hadn't pulled up yet that are pulling in now. But, yeah. And there's always some of both, guys. So there's going to be guys that know what they're talking about, that are very good fishermen. They're going to watch this and go, psh, there's always fish on them staging points. Yeah, there is. And there's always fish spawning from March to May every year, and even June this year. But that doesn't mean that there's not days where the spawning fish are going to produce better than the staging fish, and vice versa. And I'm trying to figure out a way where I can hit both of those at their peaks, and this is my theory I've come up with. Zane Sevens says staging fish are fun. 1 second in tournament on Bob Sandlin Sunday on points and windblown banks and 30-mile-an-hour wind gusts. Day before new moon and whacked them. Day before. Dude, I'm telling you, the day before the moon is the best staging bite there is. Over 30 in the boat. Awesome.